What's your business here, sweetheart? Sergeant Brad Coleman's thick fingers wrapped around Candace's skirt hem as she walked past the precinct desk. Think you can just waltz through my station? He sneered, his buddies chuckling behind him. Fatal error. The composed woman in the Navy business suit slowly turned around, and something ice-cold flashed in her dark eyes. For a moment, the entire station seemed to hold its breath, Coleman still clutching her skirt like she was his property, while Candace stood motionless, calculating every detail. The air crackled with tension. Then she spoke. "Remove your hand immediately," her voice cut through the silence like a blade, "or face the consequences." Coleman's racist smirk widened as he tightened his grip. "Or what? You gonna file a complaint, princess?" Candace's smile was razor-sharp and terrifying. "Last warning, Sergeant." "This is my house!" Coleman roared, his palm connecting with her cheek in a sharp, echoing slap, and left a burning red mark. What he didn't know was that he had just slapped the cheek of the new police chief. What she did next left the entire precinct in absolute shock. The most shocking revelation is yet to come. Stay with me to discover the explosive truth. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss this incredible story of justice served. Tuesday morning, 8:47 a.m. The Detroit Police Department's 14th precinct hummed with its usual symphony of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and the occasional burst of laughter from officers sharing weekend stories over lukewarm coffee. October rain drummed against the windows of the aging brick building, casting gray shadows across linoleum floors that had seen better decades. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, illuminating walls decorated with faded photographs of past chiefs. A gallery of stern white faces staring down from their frames like silent guardians of tradition. Candace Wright stepped through the glass entrance doors at precisely 9 o'clock, her heels clicking against the worn floor with purposeful rhythm. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every inch of respect through years of proving herself in rooms where she was often the only woman, frequently the only person of color, and always underestimated. Her Navy business suit was immaculate, not expensive enough to draw attention, but well-tailored enough to command it. A crisp white blouse, minimal jewelry, and a leather portfolio completed the ensemble of a professional woman who understood that first impressions mattered, especially when you were walking into hostile territory. The irony was delicious, really. Here she stood, the newly appointed chief of this very department, and not a soul in the building knew who she was. The mayor's insistence on secrecy had seemed excessive at first, but now Candace appreciated the wisdom. This little reconnaissance mission would tell her everything she needed to know about the culture she was inheriting. The main lobby buzzed with morning activity. Officers clustered around the front desk, their conversations a mixture of case updates and casual banter. Candace noted the invisible but unmistakable social geography of the space. White officers naturally gravitated toward the center, while officers of color seemed to orbit the periphery. Interesting. Not surprising, but definitely noted. Behind the reception desk, a young officer with premature gray streaks pecked at his keyboard with the enthusiasm of someone filling out tax forms. When a middle-aged black man approached with what appeared to be a complaint form, the officer's shoulders visibly sagged. The citizen waited patiently for acknowledgement that never came. The officer continued typing, occasionally glancing up at his computer screen, performing an elaborate pantomime of being too busy to notice the man standing directly in front of him. Candace watched this theater of indifference with professional detachment. 18 years on the force had taught her to recognize the subtle choreography of institutional bias. It was rarely dramatic. No burning crosses or shouted slurs, just 1,000 small cuts delivered with bureaucratic precision. She approached the reception desk, noting how the young officer's demeanor shifted when he spotted her. His posture straightened slightly, though his expression remained guardedly neutral. "Morning," she said pleasantly. "I need to speak with someone in administrative services." The officer looked her up and down with the practiced assessment of someone trained to categorize threats. Professional attire, check. Calm demeanor, check. Still, something in his expression suggested he was calculating whether she belonged here or was simply another citizen with complaints about police service. Administrative services, he repeated slowly, as if the words were foreign. What exactly do you need from them? Candace smiled. The question itself was telling. A white woman in a business suit would likely have been directed immediately. No questions asked. Personnel matters, she replied evenly. I have an appointment. This was technically true, though her appointment was with destiny rather than any specific individual. The officer frowned, consulting his computer screen with exaggerated concentration. I do not see any civilian appointments on the schedule today. Are you sure you have the right department? Maybe you want the community relations office down the street? The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar. Community relations. Code for problems we do not want to deal with here. Candace felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being systematically underestimated, but her expression remained pleasantly neutral. No, this is definitely the right place, she said. Perhaps you could check with your supervisor. The officer's frown deepened. He was clearly unaccustomed to civilians who did not immediately defer to his suggestions. Look, ma'am, if you do not have a scheduled appointment, what seems to be the problem here? The voice cut through their conversation like a rusty blade. Candace turned to see a tall man approaching from the hallway, his police uniform crisp despite the early hour. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, sandy brown hair cut in military precision. The nameplate on his chest read, Sergeant B. Coleman, in block letters that seemed to announce their importance. His pale blue eyes swept over Candace with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Coleman carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never seriously questioned his place in the world. Everything about his posture screamed authority. The way he planted his feet, crossed his arms, tilted his head slightly back as if looking down at everyone around him. This was a man who had grown comfortable wielding power over others, especially those he deemed beneath his station. No problem, Sergeant, the desk officer replied quickly. Just trying to help this lady find the right department. Coleman's gaze lingered on Candace with obvious assessment. She could practically see the wheels turning behind his eyes, categorizing, dismissing, filing her away under civilian nuisance. The corners of his mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. And what department might that be? Coleman asked, though his tone suggested he was humoring a child's request to see Santa Claus. Administrative services, Candace replied calmly. Personnel matters. Coleman's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. Personnel matters? Are you applying for a job? He glanced at his colleagues with barely concealed mirth. Maybe looking for work in the cafeteria? A few officers within earshot chuckled appreciatively. The joke was not particularly clever, but Coleman's audience seemed eager to laugh at whatever he offered. Candace recognized the dynamic. Alpha male performing for his pack, establishing dominance through casual humiliation of the outsider. Something like that, Candace said, maintaining her pleasant tone while mentally cataloging every face that had joined in the laughter. Coleman stepped closer, invading her personal space with practiced ease. This was clearly a man who used his physical presence as a tool of intimidation. Well, I hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but we are not exactly hiring in that department right now. Budget cuts, you know how it is. The condescension dripped from his words like honey from a broken jar. Sweetheart, a term of endearment weaponized into an insult, designed to remind her of her place in his hierarchy. Candace had heard variations of this dismissal countless times throughout her career, always delivered with a smile, always plausibly deniable, always calculated to chip away at her confidence. I appreciate your concern, she replied, but I believe my appointment is confirmed. Coleman's smile faltered slightly. He was not accustomed to persistence from people he had categorized as beneath his notice. Appointment? With who exactly? That is between me and administrative services, Candace said politely but firmly. The refusal to elaborate clearly irritated Coleman. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Candace caught the flash of genuine anger beneath his practiced civility. This was a man who expected immediate compliance with his authority, especially from women, particularly from women who looked like her. Listen here, Coleman said, his voice dropping to what he probably considered a menacing whisper. I have been working in this building for 12 years. I know every appointment, every meeting, every visitor who has legitimate business here, and right now, you are starting to look like someone who does not belong." The threat was delivered with suburban politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat. Candace felt the familiar weight of institutional power pressing down on her, the system's way of reminding outsiders that they were guests who could be ejected at any moment. She had experienced this pressure countless times before, but never quite like this. Never as someone who actually held the ultimate authority in the very building where she was being dismissed as an intruder. The irony was almost overwhelming. If Coleman only knew that he was threatening to eject his new boss, the conversation would take a dramatically different turn. But ignorance, Candace reflected, often revealed more truth than knowledge ever could. "I understand your position," she said carefully, "but I am not going anywhere until I complete my business here." Coleman's facade of politeness finally cracked. "Your business? Lady, your business is whatever I say it is. And right now, I am saying you need to turn around and walk back out those doors before this becomes a real problem." The lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Other officers sensed the confrontation brewing and began gravitating toward the entertainment. Some looked uncomfortable with the escalating tension, but none seemed inclined to intervene. This was Coleman's show, and they were content to watch from the sidelines. Candace remained perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression neutral. Years of training had taught her the power of controlled calm in volatile situations. The more agitated Coleman became, the more reasonable she appeared by contrast. "Sergeant Coleman," she said, reading his nameplate with deliberate emphasis, "I am simply trying to conduct legitimate business in a public building. I have not raised my voice, made any threats, or behaved inappropriately in any way. Is there a specific law or regulation that prevents me from being here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Coleman's face flushed slightly as he realized he had backed himself into a corner. He could not articulate any legitimate reason for ejecting her, but his authority had been questioned in front of his subordinates. For a man like Coleman, backing down was not an option. "You want to play games?" he sneered. "Fine, let's play." Candace sensed the shift in his demeanor, the moment when annoyance transformed into something more dangerous. She had seen this transition before, usually right before situations escalated beyond the point of rational resolution. Coleman was about to do something stupid, and they both knew it. As she turned slightly toward the elevator, hoping to diffuse the tension by creating some physical distance, Coleman's hand shot out and grasped the hem of her skirt. The fabric twisted in his grip as he yanked her back toward him with casual brutality. "Where do you think you are going, princess?" he snarled, his mask of civility finally shattered completely. "I was not finished talking to you." The physical contact sent shockwaves through the lobby. Even Coleman's supporters looked uncomfortable now, grabbing a woman's clothing crossed lines that most of them were not prepared to defend. But Coleman seemed oblivious to the changing mood around him, focused entirely on reasserting his dominance over this stubborn civilian who had dared to challenge his authority. Candace slowly turned to face him, her movements deliberate and controlled. When their eyes met, Coleman saw something that made him pause. Not fear, not submission, but a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to be measuring him for something unpleasant. "Remove your hand," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dangerous. "Immediately." But Coleman was too far gone to recognize the warning in her tone. His grip on her skirt tightened as his free hand rose in the air, and Candace knew exactly what was coming next. Coleman's palm connected with Candace's cheek in a sharp, echoing crack that reverberated through the lobby like a gunshot. The sound seemed to suspend time itself. Phones stopped ringing, conversations died mid-sentence, and even the ancient fluorescent lights seemed to dim in response to the audacity of what had just occurred. The force of the blow sent a burning sensation across her face, and Candace felt the familiar metallic taste of blood where her teeth had caught her inner lip. For a heartbeat, the entire precinct existed in a bubble of stunned silence. Then came the nervous laughter from Coleman's supporters, the uncomfortable shuffling of feet from those who knew they had witnessed something terrible, and the soft gasp from a female clerk who had covered her mouth in horror. "Well, that should teach her some manners," Coleman announced to his audience. flexing his fingers as if he had just swatted an annoying fly. Sometimes you have to speak a language these people understand. These people. The phrase hung in the air like toxic smoke, laying bare the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath Coleman's veneer of authority. Around the lobby, reactions varied wildly. Some officers nodded approvingly, others looked away in embarrassment, and a few younger cops appeared genuinely disturbed by what they had witnessed. Candace slowly raised her hand to her stinging cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the red handprint that Coleman had branded across her face. But instead of tears, instead of outrage, instead of the explosive reaction that Coleman clearly expected, something else entirely flickered in her dark eyes. Something cold and calculating and infinitely more dangerous than anger. She had been slapped before, not often and not recently, but the sting was familiar from her early days on patrol when suspects occasionally got lucky with a wild swing. The difference was that those suspects were criminals fighting for their freedom. Coleman was a sworn officer who had just committed assault in front of dozens of witnesses simply because his authority had been questioned by a black woman. "Sergeant Coleman," Candace said quietly, her voice carrying despite its soft tone, "I need you to understand something very clearly. You have just made the worst decision of your professional life." Coleman's triumphant smirk wavered slightly. He had expected tears, protests, maybe even a dramatic exit. What he had not expected was this eerie calm, this sense that he had just stepped into a trap of his own making. "Oh, really?" Coleman sneered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "And what exactly are you going to do about it? File a complaint? Good luck with that, sweetheart. My word against yours, and guess whose word carries more weight around here?" The casual arrogance in his voice sparked something deeper in Candace's memory. Suddenly, she was 24 again, fresh out of the academy, standing in a very similar lobby while a very similar sergeant explained why her complaint about harassment would go nowhere. Different city, different face, same poisonous attitude that treated her skin color as probable cause for dismissal. That younger Candace had swallowed her pride and walked away, learning to navigate around the Coleman types rather than confront them directly. She had spent years perfecting the art of strategic patience, building her reputation case by case, arrest by arrest, commendation by commendation. Every promotion had been earned twice over, every assignment fought for, every moment of respect carved out with surgical precision. The memory strengthened her resolve. That 24-year-old rookie had been powerless to change the system, but the woman standing here today held the ultimate authority to tear it down and rebuild it properly. "You are absolutely right," Candace replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your word does carry weight around here. At least it did until about 30 seconds ago." Coleman's frown deepened. There was something unsettling about her composure, something that suggested she knew something he did not. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the building. Officers emerged from their cubicles and offices, drawn by the promise of drama. "Look, lady," Coleman said, his voice taking on a placating tone, as he began to sense that the situation was slipping beyond his control. "Maybe we both got a little heated. Why do not we just forget this whole thing happened and you can go about your business?" The offer was delivered with the magnanimous air of a king granting clemency to a peasant. Coleman had clearly decided that his point had been made, and it was time to restore order before any supervisors took notice. But his attempt at damage control only revealed how little he understood about the magnitude of his mistake. "Forget it happened," Candace repeated thoughtfully. "Sergeant, I have spent 18 years in law enforcement, and I have never forgotten a single incident of police misconduct. Not one." The words hit the lobby like a physical blow. 18 years in law enforcement. The revelation sent ripples of confusion through the gathered officers. Coleman's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. "You are lying," he said weakly, but his voice carried no conviction. "You are not a cop. You are just some civilian trying to cause trouble." Candace reached into her portfolio and withdrew a leather badge case, holding it closed in her palm like a trump card waiting to be played. The sight of the case sent another wave of nervous energy through the crowd. Badge cases were not something civilians typically carried. Detective Candace Wright, she said clearly, though she made no move to open the case. Internal Affairs Division, specializing in misconduct investigations. And Sergeant Coleman, you have just provided me with the most clear-cut case of police brutality I have seen in my entire career. The lie rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. Internal Affairs was close enough to the truth that it would be believable, and it explained both her presence and her confidence. More importantly, it struck fear into the heart of every officer present. Internal Affairs was the boogeyman of police departments everywhere, the unit that could end careers with a single report. Coleman staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. Internal Affairs? No, that is impossible. You cannot be IA. I would have been notified if there was an investigation. Would you? Candace asked with mock sympathy. Tell me, Sergeant, in your 12 years of experience, when exactly do they notify officers that IA is conducting a surveillance operation? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Every cop in the building knew the answer. Internal Affairs never announced their presence. They watched, they recorded, they gathered evidence, and then they struck without warning. The possibility that Coleman had just assaulted an undercover IA detective in front of multiple witnesses was a nightmare scenario that could destroy not just his career, but potentially the careers of everyone who had stood by and watched. This is a setup, Coleman whispered, his voice barely audible. You baited me into this. Baited you? Candace's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. Sergeant, all I did was ask to speak with administrative services. You're the one who chose to grab my clothing and strike me in the face. How exactly did I bait you into committing assault? The logic was unassailable, and Coleman knew it. Around them, the gathered officers began to distance themselves physically and psychologically from their colleague. Career survival instincts kicked in as they realized they had witnessed what might be a career-ending incident. Officer Martinez, a young patrol cop who had been on the force for less than 2 years, discreetly pulled out his cell phone and began recording. If this was really an IA investigation, having video evidence might be the only thing standing between him and a misconduct charge for failing to intervene. Lieutenant Davies, a 20-year veteran with 6 months until retirement, felt his stomach drop as he calculated the potential fallout. If Internal Affairs was running an operation in his precinct, every decision, every case, every interaction would be scrutinized. The comfortable status quo that had defined his career was about to be shattered. You have no right, Coleman said desperately, grasping for any argument that might save him. You cannot just walk in here pretending to be a civilian and entrap officers into misconduct. Entrapment? Candace laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. Sergeant, entrapment requires inducing someone to commit a crime they would not normally commit. Are you telling me that assaulting black women is not something you would normally do? The question was a masterpiece of legal precision, designed to make any response sound incriminating. If Coleman claimed he would not normally assault anyone, he admitted that his actions were aberrant and inexcusable. If he suggested that his behavior was somehow justifiable, he revealed the depth of his prejudice. That is not what I meant, Coleman stammered, his face now red with panic rather than anger. You twisted my words. Did I? Candace tilted her head with mock confusion. Then please explain to everyone here exactly what you did mean. Help us understand the circumstances under which a 12-year veteran officer believes it is appropriate to strike a civilian who has committed no crime and posed no threat. The trap was closing around Coleman with mathematical precision. Every word he spoke only made his situation worse, yet remaining silent would be an admission of guilt. He looked around desperately for support from his colleagues, but found only worried faces and averted eyes. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been watching from the hallway, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. As one of only 3 Asian American officers in the precinct, she had her own experiences with workplace discrimination, but she also knew that speaking up could mark her as a troublemaker. Sergeant Coleman, she said carefully, maybe you should contact the union representative before this goes any further. The suggestion was delivered with the tone of someone throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. But Coleman was too panicked to recognize the wisdom in it. I do not need a union rep, he snapped. This whole thing is fabricated. She is not really IA. Then you should have no problem when I file my report, Candace replied smoothly. After all, if I am not really internal affairs, then my report will not matter, will it? The circular logic left Coleman speechless. Whether Candace was really IA or not, the incident had been witnessed by dozens of officers and potentially recorded on multiple cell phones. The truth would come out eventually, and when it did, Coleman would be standing alone with blood on his hands and nowhere to hide. As if summoned by the mounting tension, the elevator doors opened with a mechanical ding that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. Deputy Chief Thomas Grayson stepped out, his gray hair slightly disheveled, and his usually pristine uniform wrinkled from an early morning emergency meeting at City Hall. He carried a manila folder thick with documents and wore the expression of a man who had been dealing with administrative headaches since before dawn. Grayson paused at the edge of the crowd, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. He saw Coleman's flushed face, the red mark on the black woman's cheek, the circle of nervous officers, and the cell phones capturing everything. His heart sank as he realized he was looking at a public relations disaster in the making. "What in the world is going on here?" Grayson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of 28 years in law enforcement. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Candace felt the moment crystallizing around her. This was it, the point where her carefully constructed performance would either achieve its purpose or collapse entirely. She looked directly at Deputy Chief Grayson, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the genuine concern in his expression. "Deputy Chief," she said formally, "I believe you and I need to have a very serious conversation." Deputy Chief Grayson's eyes swept across the scene with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades reading crisis situations. The red handprint on the black woman's cheek told him everything he needed to know about the physical assault. But her unnaturally calm demeanor suggested there was much more to this story than met the eye. "Ma'am," Grayson said respectfully, stepping closer to Candace while carefully positioning himself between her and Coleman. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" The simple human decency in his voice was like a breath of fresh air in the toxic atmosphere that Coleman had created. Candace appreciated both his professionalism and his protective instincts, though she suspected both were about to be tested in ways he could never imagine. "I am fine, Deputy Chief," she replied, noting how his nameplate identified him as the second highest ranking officer in the building. "Though I believe Sergeant Coleman here may need some guidance on appropriate conduct toward civilians." Coleman opened his mouth to protest, but Grayson silenced him with a sharp look that could have frozen fire. "Sergeant, you will remain silent until I tell you otherwise," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And someone please clear this area of unnecessary personnel immediately." The crowd of onlookers began to disperse reluctantly, though several officers lingered at the edges of the lobby, unwilling to miss what promised to be a career-defining moment for Coleman. Officer Martinez continued recording discreetly, his phone angled to capture both Candace and Grayson in the frame. "Now then," Grayson continued, his attention focused entirely on Candace, "I would like to hear exactly what happened here, and please take your time. Every detail matters." Candace studied his face carefully, noting the intelligence behind his eyes and the genuine concern in his expression. Thomas Grayson had a reputation as a fair man, someone who had risen through the ranks on merit rather than politics. If anyone in this building could handle what was about to happen, it would be him. "Deputy Chief," she began, reaching into her portfolio with deliberate slowness, "before I explain what happened, I think you should know who I am." The manila folder in Grayson's hand slipped slightly as recognition flickered across his features. He had been carrying personnel files from the morning's emergency meeting at City Hall, files that included photographs and background information for the department's new leadership appointments. The woman standing before him bore a striking resemblance to someone whose face he had been studying just hours earlier. "Oh no," he whispered, the color draining from his face as the pieces fell into place. "Please tell me you are not who I think you are." Candace opened her badge case with the practiced flip of someone who had done it thousands of times. The gold shield caught the fluorescent light, but it was the identification card beside it that made Grayson's knees nearly buckle. "Chief Candace Wright," she said formally, "as of today, the new head of this department." The words hit the lobby like a physical explosion. Coleman staggered backward, his face cycling through denial, horror, and panic at lightning speed. The few remaining onlookers stood frozen in shock, their phones suddenly feeling like hot coals in their hands as they realized they had just recorded a sergeant assaulting his own police chief. "This cannot be happening," Coleman whispered, his voice barely audible above the sudden ringing in his ears. "This is impossible. You are not, you cannot be." But the badge was real, the identification card was official, and Deputy Chief Grayson's mortified expression confirmed what Coleman's mind refused to accept. He had just committed career suicide in the most spectacular way imaginable, and he had done it in front of an audience with camera phones. "Chief Wright," Grayson said, his voice tight with professional horror, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am about this incident. This is not representative of the department's values or standards, and I assure you that immediate disciplinary action will be taken." Candace studied his face, seeing genuine distress rather than political damage control. Grayson was clearly a man who took pride in his department's reputation, and Coleman's actions had just shattered that pride into 1,000 pieces. "Deputy Chief," she replied calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but I want you to understand something. This incident, as unfortunate as it was, has provided me with invaluable insight into the culture and operational standards of this department. In many ways, Sergeant Coleman has done me a favor." The statement sent another wave of confusion through the lobby. How could being assaulted possibly be considered a favor? Coleman looked around desperately, hoping someone would explain how this nightmare had suddenly become even worse. "Sergeant Coleman," Candace continued, turning her attention to the man who had just destroyed his own career, "I want to thank you for demonstrating exactly why this department needs new leadership. Your actions today have shown me problems that might have taken months to identify through normal channels." Coleman opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. "Chief, I mean, ma'am, I did not know. If I had known who you were—" "Stop right there," Candace interrupted, her voice carrying the full weight of command authority for the first time since entering the building. "Sergeant, your apology reveals exactly what is wrong with your thinking. You are not sorry for assaulting a civilian. You are sorry for assaulting someone with authority over you. Do you understand the difference?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Coleman's face flushed as he realized the trap his own words had created. Around the lobby, the remaining officers shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the uncomfortable truth in her observation. "The badge I carry does not make me more deserving of respect than any other citizen who walks through these doors," Candace continued, her voice rising slightly as she warmed to her theme. "Every person who enters this building, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or background, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. That is not a courtesy we extend when convenient. That is a fundamental requirement of professional law enforcement." Detective Chen, who had been watching from the hallway, felt tears stinging her eyes as she heard someone in authority finally articulate what she had been feeling for years. How many times had she watched colleagues treat civilians differently based on assumptions about their worth or importance? "Furthermore," Candace continued, "the fact that you felt comfortable behaving this way in front of so many witnesses tells me that this kind of conduct has been normalized in this department. That ends today." Deputy Chief Grayson nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the systemic changes that would be necessary to prevent future incidents. "Chief Wright, what are your immediate instructions regarding this situation?" "First," Candace replied, "Sergeant Coleman will be suspended pending a full investigation into this incident and a review of his entire service record. I want to know if this behavior represents a pattern or an isolated incident." Coleman's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Suspension meant lost pay, damaged reputation, and the possibility of criminal charges. Everything he had worked for over 12 years was evaporating in real time. "Second," Candace continued, "every officer who witnessed this incident will participate in mandatory retraining on appropriate conduct towards civilians and de-escalation techniques. Watching misconduct happen without intervention makes you complicit in the misconduct itself." The remaining officers in the lobby exchanged nervous glances. They had thought they were just watching entertainment, but now they were being held accountable for their passive participation in Coleman's actions. "Third," she said, We will be implementing new policies for civilian interactions, body cameras for all officers, and an independent oversight committee to review complaints against department personnel. The days of investigating ourselves are over. Deputy Chief Grayson felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement as he contemplated the scope of changes Chief Wright was proposing. They would be difficult to implement and would face resistance from veteran officers, but they were long overdue. Chief Wright, he said carefully, I want you to know that you have my full support in implementing these reforms. This department has operated on outdated practices for too long, and change is necessary. I appreciate that, Deputy Chief, Candace replied, because I am going to need experienced officers like you to help guide this transition. Change is never easy, but it is essential if we want to rebuild trust with the community we serve. Officer Martinez, still recording from his position near the elevator, felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to Chief Wright speak. For the first time since joining the force, he felt pride in his profession rather than shame at his colleagues' behavior. Now, Candace said, turning back to Coleman one final time, Sergeant, I want you to understand that your actions today were not just unprofessional, they were illegal. You committed assault in front of multiple witnesses, and you will face the same consequences as any other citizen who commits such an act. Coleman's face crumpled as the full weight of his situation finally sank in. Criminal charges meant more than just losing his job. They meant losing his pension, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. However, Candace continued, and Coleman looked up with desperate hope, I also believe in redemption and second chances. If you are willing to acknowledge your mistakes, undergo counseling for whatever anger and prejudice led to this behavior, and commit to becoming a better person, then perhaps some good can come from this terrible situation. The offer was more generous than Coleman had any right to expect, and everyone in the lobby knew it. Chief Wright could have destroyed him completely, but instead she was offering him a path toward redemption. Ma'am, Coleman said, his voice barely above a whisper, I know I do not deserve your compassion, but I accept your offer. I want to be better than I was today. Candace studied his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. What she saw instead was a broken man who was finally beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. Very well, she said finally. Deputy Chief Grayson will handle the administrative details of your suspension and arrange for appropriate counseling services. Your future with this department will depend entirely on your willingness to change. As Coleman was escorted away by two officers, Candace turned to address the remaining personnel in the lobby. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space, today marks the beginning of a new era for this department. We will serve our community with honor, respect, and professionalism, or we will find new careers. The choice is yours. Officer Martinez stopped recording and walked over to Chief Wright. Ma'am, he said nervously, I recorded most of what happened here today. Would you like me to provide that video for the investigation? Candace smiled at the young officer, recognizing someone who was willing to do the right thing even when it was uncomfortable. That would be very helpful, Officer Martinez. Thank you for thinking of evidence preservation. As the lobby gradually returned to normal operations, Deputy Chief Grayson approached Chief Wright with obvious admiration. Ma'am, if you do not mind me saying so, the way you handled that situation was masterful. You turned a potential disaster into a teaching moment. Thank you, Deputy Chief, Candace replied, but the real work starts now. Changing a culture is much harder than handling a single incident. We have months of difficult conversations and policy changes ahead of us. Yes, ma'am, Grayson agreed, but after watching how you handled Sergeant Coleman, I have confidence that we can build something better here. As they walked toward the elevator together, Candace reflected on the morning's events. She had come to observe the department's culture, and she had certainly learned more than she had bargained for. But she had also discovered that change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The elevator doors closed behind them, and Candace smiled slightly as she thought about the work ahead. Building a better police department would not be easy, but it was necessary. And sometimes the most important changes began with the smallest acts of courage, like a young officer deciding to record injustice, or a veteran deputy chief choosing to support reform over tradition. Change was coming to the Detroit Police Department, and it would start with treating every person who walked through their doors with the dignity and respect they deserved. That was not just good policing, it was basic human decency, and it was long overdue.